Let's begin by examining how critical the situation is as far as the northern shrimp are concerned.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, what we did today was an information session, essentially talking about the ongoing changes in the estuary and Gulf of St. Lawrence. So changes in terms of warming temperatures and decreasing oxygen concentrations, and how these affect northern shrimp stocks in the ecosystem.
How significant is that temperature change you're talking about in the St. Lawrence?
Yeah, so the temperature change, so the warming of the deep water layer, which corresponds to the northern shrimp habitat, is significant and has been sustained for well over a decade now. So essentially the average temperature over the bottom temperature over the entire Gulf has increased from about 5.2 degrees Celsius in 2009 to 7 degrees in 2022. So it's a 1.8 degrees average increase for bottom water temperature in the Gulf over the span of only 13 years. So it's quite a marked change.
Mm-hmm. You're referring to deeper waters. Can you maybe help us understand the difference between the deeper waters and maybe the surface waters?
Yes, absolutely. So the estuary and Gulf of St. Lawrence is a stratified ecosystem. So there are different water layers that are essentially superimposed in the ecosystem. We can think of this as a three-dimensional environment, but in this case, in the vertical dimension, we have a very stable water layer that's associated with the bottom. Mm-hmm. And that's the one where warming is the most pronounced. This layer is superimposed by what we call the cold intermediate layer, which is usually created by the ice cover from the preceding winter. And then there's the surface water layer, which is very dynamic. That's a highly variable condition water layer owing to wind and wave action, etc.
What is, Madame Roux, behind the warming waters?
So behind the warming waters essentially is a change in the contribution of different water masses to the St. Lawrence ecosystem. So the St. Lawrence is I always say it's a meeting place between the cold and well-oxygenated waters from the Labrador Current and the Arctic, mm-hmm. and the warmer and less oxygenated waters that come from the south, mainly via the Gulf Stream. So these waters are mixing and they're meeting in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. And over the recent decade, we have an enhanced contribution of the warmer Atlantic waters relative to the cold water in the system.
Now, I don't know if I understood this correctly, but you mentioned that the waters coming in from the Atlantic, lower Atlantic, the southern part, have less oxygen. Is there a link between water temperature and oxygen levels?
Yes. So usually there's a negative correlation. There is a negative correlation, but there's also many other oceanographic factors that can explain lower oxygen. But typically the waters from the Gulf Stream, the large and warm surface current that comes from the south, are warmer and lower oxygen concentration waters when they enter the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
So more of that kind of water, less of that oxygenated water that comes from the Labrador Current.
Yes.
How has this situation then affected the shrimp population's movement so far?
Yes. So what we've demonstrated in recent years and again today is that essentially there's a displacement of northern shrimp. So where conditions are becoming increasingly unfavorable for the species, the northern shrimp prefers colder water and well-oxygenated water. So as warming is occurring and oxygen concentrations are decreasing, shrimp is moving to try and find conditions that are still favorable for its productivity. So we've seen that displacement of shrimp very clearly in the estuary starting in 2018. So shrimp moved towards shallower water that were colder and more oxygenated. We're also seeing overall in the Gulf of St. Lawrence a reduction in the area of concentration of northern shrimp. So essentially the area where most of the shrimp biomass is found is shrinking. And compared to its rather well distributed area. Like essentially shrimp was found in its peak abundance. It was found throughout the ecosystem, but now we see it being more and more concentrated in small areas.
So as a reference for our listeners and for myself as well, this might sound as a weird question, but, we know the Nordic shrimp as being Sept-Îles and Matane. And so where are they headed to? Can you geographically give us a sense so that we can visualize where those shrimps are headed towards?
They're still there, but they're concentrating in areas where the waters are colder and more oxygenated. So it can mean moving towards shallower depths. That's what we've seen in the estuary. So they're still associated with the bottom because the species is always associated with the bottom, but they've moved towards shallower depths where the water is still colder.
And I'm thinking that has a direct impact on the fishing. If it's harder to catch them because they are lower, then therefore they're less available for fishermen.
Yes, that's what was observed last year in the commercial fisheries. So for the first time in summer, like in the fishing season 2023, the catch per unit effort, the fisheries yields essentially were lower indeed for northern shrimp. So they were harder to find and catch.
In the recent months, we've been talking about the impact on the redfish, the deep water redfish on the shrimp. Is there a correlation there between the fact that the waters are warming, the shrimp are going deeper, and the redfish are there to eat them up?
Yes. Well, redfish is a predator of northern shrimp. And redfish is currently observed in very large biomass in the ecosystem. So clearly it is contributing an enhanced predation pressure on the species. In terms of overlapping distribution, redfish move deeper into the deep channels of the ecosystem as they get larger. But northern shrimp hasn't really, it doesn't have the same movement. It's not showing the same movement. So northern shrimp essentially has stayed in those areas where it's been fished commercially for some time, but is currently found in smaller concentrations. So yes, redfish has a predation effect. There's no clear correlation between the ongoing changes, environmental changes in the ecosystem and the very high biomass of redfish. We know that redfish, we had 3 successive, very important cohorts of redfish coming into the system in 2011, 2012, and 2013. So conditions that essentially favored the survival of juvenile redfish to reach very high biomass. But we're not seeing this very punctual, very high recruitment of redfish. It's not something that has been continuous over time. So those fish are there in the ecosystem, but it's essentially the young redfish that were produced over those 3 consecutive years of very high survival of juveniles.
And anyone who have young children at home or adolescents know that they're pretty hungry and they want to eat. On a more serious matter, Madame Roux, how will fish practices, considering all of this, have to adapt to this new reality?
Yes, well, that's the question. The purpose of the information session today was to provide the available evidence as it is now. We are seeing genuine negative effects, unfortunately, of ongoing environmental changes on northern shrimp stocks. So this information is being shared so that we can and indeed adapt practices and fishing practices and industry to ongoing changes in species availability and biomass in the ecosystem in response to environmental change.
This is such an interesting conversation. I wish we had more time to continue, Madame Roux. Again, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this afternoon. I feel this will not be our last conversation.
Thank you very much.